This bit on measuring expected return and risk is sponsored by Examinator Online, the platform to go to for SFC exam practice questions. What is expected return? It is the weighted average of possible returns, and you can easily get a question presenting you figures in paper 7 asking you to calculate the expected return. What is risk? Risk reflects dispersion of possible returns around the expected return, and it's measured by standard deviation of returns. The higher the standard deviation, the wider the dispersion. The lower the standard deviation, the narrower the dispersion. Standard deviation is calculated by taking the square root of the variance. Let's look at an example and then perform the calculations. Security X has a 10% probability of a 15% return, an 80% probability of a 25% return, and a 10% probability of a 35% return. On the other hand, Security Y has a 10% probability of a 10% return, an 80% probability of a 30% return, and a 10% probability of a 50% return. You're asked to calculate the expected return and standard deviation for both Security X and Security Y. So let's look at how we calculate, how we measure the expected return. We list down the probabilities of each possible return, and we calculate the weighted average. So you take 0.1 of 15%, and that gives us 1.5, 0.8 of 25%, giving 20, 0.1 of 35%. We add them up, and we get an expected return for Security X of 25%. Please note that we translated the probabilities from percentage into decimal, otherwise it will not work. For Security Y, we perform the same calculation. We add up the expected values, and we get the expected return of 30%. It is a simple weighted average calculation, and that could be the approach you have to take for an expected return question at paper 7. Let's move on and look at measuring the risk. Now, this is a little bit more complex. I'll run through the formula. It's unlikely they will ask you to perform the whole calculation, but maybe parts of it. So for Security X, we know that the expected return was 25% from the previous slide. So we look at the dispersion. X, possible return 15% minus 25%, that gives us minus 10. 25% minus 25 gives us 0. 35% minus 25% gives us 10. We then square the difference to get rid of the negative and apply the probability. So P multiplied by X minus X bar squared comes out to be 10, 0, 10. The 20 that you've calculated is the variance. To calculate the standard deviation, we take the square root of the variance and we get 4.47%. When you take the square root and arrive at the standard deviation, you're back to the original unit of measurement, which was percentage. The variance is not percentage, it's squared. We take the square root to get the standard deviation, which is the measure of risk. We perform the same calculation for Security Y, X minus X bar. So remember, X bar expected return was 30%, 10 minus 30 gives us minus 20, and we continue that calculation to give us 40, 0, 40 when we apply the probability and square the difference, and that gives us a variance of 80. The standard deviation is the square root of 80, giving us 8.94%. So what you can tell from these calculations is the Security X has an expected return of 25% with a standard deviation of 4.47. Security Y has a higher expected return of 30%, but with it comes higher risk, a higher standard deviation, 8.94%. That material can be the subject of one, maybe two questions on paper 7. Follow these principles and you will get the question correct. As ever, the best way to prepare is to practice questions. There are over 300 Paper 7 practice questions on Examinator Online.